I think we probably a little, yeah, a little earlier than 6:58, but I'm going to mute.
Okay.
All right.
It's the NAMI Cobb educational meeting, and I'm glad you can join us tonight. We have an excellent speaker, and I'll introduce her in a second. I just first have a few quick messages. We recently had an update. We recently did NAMI Walk Our Way for NAMI Cobb Stigma Busters, and the NAMI Cobb Stigma Busters are still, you can still make donations. Most people have already walked, but they're still there. You can still make donations to the team. So that's available. We also have our 2 support groups. They are virtual and they are running on Monday nights. We have the family support group and the connection support group for people with a mental health condition. Both groups are going strong, and they, as I said, Monday nights. And in order to register for them, what you have to do is go to our website, NAMI, N-A-M-I, Cobb, C-O-B, N-A-M-I, N-A-M-I-C-O-B-B, NAMICobb.org, and there'll be the information for registering. And those are really the main updates. So now I'll take great pleasure in introducing Kartar Diamond. Kartar just recently, I think this book has just come out in the last, last couple of weeks, right? But it's available on, the book is called Noah's Schizphrenia, A Mother's Search for Truth. And it is available on Amazon. In fact, I ordered one on Friday and I finished it. It's only about 200 pages. I finished it on Saturday. I ordered it on Wednesday. It arrived Friday. So you can order them on Amazon. And it really, it's in California, but it has just a lot of things that I think people who have gone through any sort of severe mental illness with a child or yourselves, a lot of things you'll probably relate to in the book. I found it fascinating. So with that, I'll switch it over to you, Kartar. And we really appreciate you joining us. This is one of the advantages of Zoom. We're able to get really it gives us access to just a tremendous number of excellent speakers. So, Kartar.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm really very pleased already with the reaction that I've gotten from various NAMI chapters. In fact, last night I was on a family support call via Zoom with some ladies in Kauai, Hawaii. And so even though there's local color, as we say in my memoir, because most of the things that happened with me and my son happened in LA County, Los Angeles. These things are nearly universal, the struggles that we go through. And so even I wrote in the beginning intro, I said, you can fill in the blanks on a lot of these issues. In fact, even if your loved one doesn't have schizophrenia, they might have bipolar disorder, they might have some serious mental illness where you're still going through the same things no matter where you live. And some cities and states have the same kinds of services or laws or policies, but they refer to them with different numbers and different code. Like I've just, even in Southern California, when somebody calls a mobile psychiatric team to come and evaluate somebody, they can be called a PET team, a SMART team, a CAT team, you know, all these different acronyms. But again, it's still a similar kind of process. So given the time that we have, I thought that maybe I would start out like the old school book tours where I read just 2 or 3 pages from the book to give you a flavor of you know, what it's like, what my writing style is like, and how things evolved. The first chapter doesn't start right at the beginning, but it starts right at the first psychotic break. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit more about all the other issues that are touched upon in the memoir. And again, in hopes of being able to console other family members, to educate, to provide resources. I have a lot of different agendas with the book. And you mentioned that word stigma. And it's, you know, it's unfortunately that people with mental illness are still suffering a lot of stigma, but parents and other family members experience their own kind of stigma as well. So that's what I think really comes out a lot in the memoir. So I'll read a little bit. I haven't done this yet before, so it feels very academic, but you know, we'll see how it goes. I can get feedback of whether it was good or not. Okay, so here we go with chapter 1. My son stood in the living room, his hands over his head, anguish in his eyes, screaming, "Every musician in LA is stealing my ideas." I was blown away by what he said. I couldn't understand why he would make such a statement. I could tell he was upset and dead serious, so I tried to comfort him by being rational. I responded to Noah by saying, "But you don't know every musician in LA, so how could that be possible?" He was only 15 years old, and already he was an excellent musician who played in a couple of bands with schoolmates. At age 11, he formed his group called the Liquid Nixons. His delusion that adult musicians in Los Angeles were stealing his ideas seemed to come out of nowhere. Years later, I would learn that when a person is in a psychotic state, trying to be rational with the person or refuting their reality is just going to make things worse. Allowing the person to know you think their perceptions may not be grounded in reality is not a way to garner trust or de-escalate a crisis. Up until that point, my communication with my son had always been enjoyable and sympathetic, and he even once told me as a youngster that he appreciated the way I explained things to him. Not now. I couldn't comfort him at all, and he stomped off into his bedroom. Every 10 minutes that night, Noah came out of his bedroom, which was right next to my home office, and popped his head into the room. With a glassy look in his big brown eyes and a crazed smile on his young, handsome face, he announced which rock star he had just become. I didn't know whether he was joking or not. He went back into his room, turned up the music, listened to a couple of songs from Ziggy Stardust, and then came into my office to say, "Now I am David Bowie." Minutes later, after listening to some other musical icon, he again barged in on me and stated he had become this person or that person. It was a real departure from his usual behavior. Noah already owned the image of a teen idol. At 5'6" with a lean frame, his thick shoulder-length brown hair made him look like a young Jimmy Page or Harry Styles. Later in the evening, he emerged from his bedroom just wearing his boxer shorts. He went into the living room and started whipping the couch with a belt, laughing maniacally. After a while, he quieted down, retreated to his bedroom for the rest of the evening, and I was left confused and worried. I made a phone call to his father. In retrospect, if I had understood then what I know today, I would have taken him to the hospital immediately. Of course, there was no second guessing whether or not he would have gone with me willingly. But the next day he did. We went to the emergency room. There were no other people besides us in the reception room, so I had no reason to anticipate much of a wait. For almost 3 hours, we were mostly ignored, except for bringing my son into a small exam room to get his insurance information and to get weighed. Every 30 minutes or so, some staff person came and lied to us about how he would be seen momentarily. Noah and I were both getting hungry and hypoglycemic. After the 4th time they tried to stall, we just left. Little did I know then, waiting for emergency psychiatric treatment can take not only hours, but sometimes even days. It would be 9 years later that my son would wait 5 days in the ER at another hospital before being admitted. I'll stop there. So I have a number of reasons of why I wrote the book, and I happen to be a writer. I've written other books, but nothing remotely like this. So for me, it's a coping mechanism to write. And in fact, I even started a little NAMI family writers group a couple years ago where they just let it all hang out. People were writing poems, essays, little vignettes, really getting a lot out of their system by writing. And there's something about writing that can also make what you've experienced feel more, I don't know, you get a little bit detached from it. I think it's some kind of therapy in and of itself to get it out of your head and onto paper. And I continued to write, and I don't know what will happen, with my son eventually when I'm dead and gone. We're only kind of barely halfway through this life journey with him. But I don't want what has happened to us to be in vain. And I feel like if I share this information, as other authors have about their mentally ill loved one, that we can learn and grow and, again, destigmatize this by bringing it into literally pop culture by writing about it. So I wanted to give more of a picture of who the person is, because it's very easy, as we know with our loved ones, we know them. Other people don't. Even when I drive down the street, if I see a homeless person, I don't know their backstory, and I'm obviously seeing them at their worst. But we know our loved ones when they were at their best or better. And to bring this into the consciousness of the general public, which can eventually sway policy and legislation, we want to humanize these people who are very vulnerable and suffering. So when you put a face on it and a name in a book, Noah's Schizophrenia, it brings more of that human element to the situation and not just a statistic. I also think that a lot of people are interested in knowing what goes on in the mind of somebody with schizophrenia who's having hallucinations and delusions. And so I added some of the things that my son has discussed with me, actually in the dialogue of the memoir. I also wanted to bring to the attention of whoever's reading the book how the mental health care system truly is broken. It's not a cliche. It's very dysfunctional. I think that's a national problem. And there's no single part of this very complicated system that's working efficiently. And there's many parts to it, as you know. I wanted to give kind of a wake-up call to some of the mental health providers who have systematically ignored and disrespected parents and family members. And in fact, some of you may know that when NAMI first started, I think in the 1970s, there was still a prevailing notion that schizophrenia was caused by what they called the schizophrenic mother, and that this all had to do with behavior and upbringing. And we know now that this is a genetically predisposed disposition. It's a brain disorder, and some very specific things happen to the developing brain. And so I want to appeal to people in the mental health care industry that they should make parents and extended family members, or whoever's really taking responsibility and caretaking, to invite us more into the recovery team process and to get simply more input. I relayed some of the horrible insults that I experienced as a mother, being dismissed, being really treated very shabby when these people, whether it was a doctor, a psychiatrist, a nurse, a board and care operator, input that I could have given them about my son could have really helped redirect things in a positive way. But when people don't return your calls because of HIPAA, privacy laws, it's very, very frustrating. Another level of writing the book, another reason, is to also have something physical that I can put in the hands of or mail off to legislators, people who are actively involved with creating or amending mental health care policy. Just as one example, right now in California, there's a group of people that I'm not actively involved with, but I'm looking at their emails, and I think they call themselves California Advocates. And they're really trying to address a very large issue, a statewide issue that has to do with fraud on a major scale, billions of dollars of money that should have been earmarked for seriously mentally ill people is not going to the most vulnerable, needy people. And I think that if the average person and taxpayer knew that that was going on, that there could be a revolution, there could be some more progress. And so that level of advocacy is something that I've been drawn into slowly over the last 15 years, because some of you, who are on this Zoom call, you may have also been involved in the mental health care world for as long as me or longer. And after a while, you start wondering, why are things the way they are? Why aren't, why am I not getting the help that I need or that my loved one needs? And, there's that saying, follow the money. It couldn't be more true with the mental health care system. I know that a much smaller part of my audience is the, quote, general public. In fact, when you're pitching a book to a literary agent and want to tell them what your marketing plans are, you don't say that you think everybody will enjoy reading the book or need the book. That lets them know that you have no idea who your audience is. So I put it out there up front. My audience is definitely fellow family members, first and foremost, to console and to educate. And hopefully people will learn by my mistakes as well. The second tier, again, being the mental health care system, the third tier being legislators, and then a small group of people will be interested in this because peripherally they may want to understand things like, why is there a homeless encampment 3 blocks from my house now? That was never the case, and now it is. Why are things the way they are? So they may draw that link that it has to do with untreated mental illness. Or for instance, when there's a mass shooting or a school shooting, people start wondering, why is this happening? Why can't people get the care that they need? So I do hope that the general public, a small portion, will also get something out of the memoir. And to also highlight NAMI. You know, NAMI is one of the premier national, state, county organizations that really helps parents cope and learn, you know, where their resources are. So the book outlines some wild experiences that we had with psychiatrists. There was a period of time where my son was sent to an out-of-state school because he became ill as a minor. That presents a whole other picture versus college age or later in life. We also went through what's called the board and care systems, and Peter told me that you don't have the typical board and cares that we have in California. But I have to say that in California, they're closing left and right because they run on a shoestring budget. It actually costs more to board your dog in a kennel than the amount of money that people get from the government to live in these board and cares. And they've never been a great solution. We can't live at home. My son also went through sober living houses. That's a whole other picture. We had less than stellar experiences in hospitals. And then it finally ended up in homelessness, which shocked the heck out of me. I really went through quite a mental gymnastics the summer that happened just 4 years ago. Couldn't believe we got to that point. But I had an end game in mind, and so I let it go for a while. I also speak about things called, conservatorships. I don't know if your state has a conservatorship process, anything like California, but we could talk about it. We have in our state and other states something called an IMD, which stands for Institute of Mental Disease. And they are temporary, they're locked facilities, but people are in them temporarily, meaning 6 months to a year or two, compared to many decades ago or a century ago when people actually were put in what they used to call insane asylums indefinitely. And of course, those have a horrible, horrible history of neglect, and they were not therapeutic environments. However, we now live in an age nationally where we have more people living on the streets and in jail who are mentally ill than the same demographic who used to be at least in psychiatric hospitals. So there's a lot that one could say, that the pros and cons of all of that. So maybe I'm sure we could open it up for questions or comments to have a discussion, because I'd like to address specific concerns that anybody on the call might have, or any kind of questions. We got it? Tiffany's in control, right?
Yeah, I'll start with one.
Okay.
And if you would say, in the book, you mentioned how debit cards assisted you with providing your son with money, and then cell phones. So could you say a little bit about that?
Well, again, people on the call may have various experiences themselves in how they can provide for somebody, their loved one. And, you know, I might say your son or daughter, but you could also be taking care of your brother or sister, or even a parent for that matter. And if they don't live with us, we have to have some lines of communication. I had relayed in my book that my son was selling phones left and right. And in California, I don't know if they say this in other places, but going back 5, 6, 7 years ago, the free phones that they would give people who are unemployed, we used to call them, or we still call them, Obama phones. I don't know if they do that anywhere else, but it was because of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. It seemed to come in sync with that. So anybody can have a phone for free now who has low income or no income. But in the book, I was saying how he kept selling them. And so at a certain point, well, you can't just continually get them. They'll only issue you a new one once a year. And so I was also buying him phones, and he was using that as his currency. I mean, my son really got totally into panhandling. Another thing that horrifies me, you know, when I just even think about it, the way he was raised, and you know, I don't know how he picked up on that, but he did very quickly. And so if he was wanting to get money for cigarettes, he would sell whatever he had: phones, guitar, new shoes, clothing, you name it. So it was very difficult with the cell phones. And there was a period of time where I just had to not supply them. It was very hard to levy consequences for his actions because people with mental illness, they often don't hit rock bottom, and they often have no insight into their illness. And that's a big thing that we try to educate the public about. With serious mental illness, about 50% do not have insight. It's called anosognosia. And like dementia or Alzheimer's, they do not know that they're ill, even when their circumstances might be pointing exactly in that direction. For a rational person, they're often willing to put up with some very, you know, a lot of hardship and not make that connection that it has to do with them having a thought disorder or delusions or what have you. And so we have to deal with that. But there was a time where we were trying to give my son his legally allotted money that he gets from the government benefits, SSI benefits, Social Security income, and trying to dole it out on these debit cards in a sensible way. When he was homeless, he needed to eat. So I was giving him, I was actually giving him $30 a day on the debit card to feed himself, to buy himself cigarettes. I was able to track him online where purchases were being made. And at the point, you know, that was the best I could do to sort of use the debit card also as a way to sort of keep track of him. I don't necessarily, you know, recommend that. Some people have other more creative ways to get communication intact or to have any kind of leverage. For instance, some parents have their adult child living at home, and the way they're able to levy some control is to say, if you take your medication or if you meet with this social worker, you can continue to live with me. You continue to have this budget or that budget. So we try to, and I'm sure you talk about it in your family support meetings, of ways that you can try to get a positive positive outcome of dealing with somebody who may not be compliant for many years or ever. So that's what I have to say on that. What else? More questions?
Hey, Kartar, this is Tiffany. I see a question that was posted in our chat. It says, you mentioned an end game for your son's homelessness. What was it? Did you achieve it?
Yes, and when I think about the randomness of it, it's still scary to me. The situation, at least, you know, where we were living in LA County at the time, I even had a Department of Mental Health employee tell me, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. That was their advice. And what happens in a lot of situations is that, let's say you have a person living at home with you and they're psychotic, and you call the police or you call the social workers. They'll arrive, and by that time, your loved one may have calmed down. And then when, let's say, the police or the social workers are asking questions, they really don't feel like your loved one needs to be hospitalized, especially not against their will. We call that involuntary. And in California, there's a code for it called the 5150, 72-hour hold. Even the famous Kanye West had to be 5150 a few times, you know, in the state of California. So it's something that happens on an involuntary basis. But if law enforcement or social workers arrive and the person is in a home where they say, okay, this person has a roof over their head, they have food, they're with loved ones, they seem calm now, we're out of here. We got other priorities. We got to go get the guy who's dangling off a bridge right now. And so I specifically did not bring my son home. So when I refer to my end game, is that I knew that I would have a problem getting him the higher level of care that he needed if I brought him home, if I threw him in the shower, you know, if I got him cleaned up. Unfortunately, he wouldn't have looked as desperate as he really was. And so I allowed him to be homeless. I was in the background the entire time trying to find emergency shelter for him, because I became aware within a few days that he wasn't bottoming out. He was literally on Skid Row in downtown LA, one of the worst possible large-scale homeless encampments, 11,000 desperate people taking up like 5 city blocks. It's a third world there. It's horrendous. And he was there. And yet he wasn't complaining. He didn't call me and say, Mom, get me out of here. I've had enough. I'm going to do whatever it takes to obey, you know, the house rules wherever you can find me a place to live. I mean, he made it impossible to find a place for him to live at a certain point. He kept getting evicted. And so I was trying to find him a place, but as it was playing out, I was watching and seeing, wow, he is gravely ill. He doesn't even understand the severity of what's going on. He had people assault him. He had his glasses smashed where he couldn't see anything one day. I mean, it went on and on. But I figured that in that state, and it did come towards the end of the summer of 2016, all these different activities and things led up to the fact that he did finally get 5150. He did get hospitalized. So there was a method to what I was doing, and I was calling various agencies. There's something that I believe is in existence in at least half of the states in the United States called AOT, Assisted Outpatient Treatment. And I was trying to work with them also to line that up. It's a case manager, a therapist. They will go out to wherever the person is, even if they're homeless, if they can find where they are, and they'll start trying to do therapy with the person and convince them that they should agree to come with them and provide some housing and some treatment. So I was doing all of that while he was homeless, and I still just trying to get resources. But even some of these supposed emergency resources don't respond right away. And I think I mentioned it in my memoir that I called one emergency homeless shelter hotline, and they called me back 3 months later. And one thing that is just occurring to me now is that in California and in LA County, we have supposedly a lot of resources. And yet there's so many people that there's still 2-month, 3-month waiting lists. Someone could be in the hospital waiting a year, literally, I'm not exaggerating, a year or more, just sitting in a hospital waiting to get into one of these enriched step-down board and cares or some other therapy. So on the one hand, we have a lot of awareness about mental illness and the need for treatment, but the sheer numbers of people make it so that it's still hard to get things happening quickly. So, yeah. More questions?
Yes, more questions and comments. If you can see inside the Q&A icon, we have a comment about the book, like a response to their appreciation of your book.
Should I click on Q&A?
Yeah.
I don't want to do anything to get disconnected, right?
Right. Can you see it?
Jennifer says, your book sounds so much like my story. The main difference is that I chose the path of having my son live with us. So instead of homelessness, people in a motel room, they are in our house, and holes in the walls are on the wall, our walls, rather than the board and care. Yep. I love your writing style and couldn't put the book down. Yeah, I mean, I expect, like right now, I'm reading a book by Randy Kay. She wrote it a decade ago, and it's called Ben Behind the Voices. And as soon as I'm done with it, I'm going to write a positive review for her. But again, reading it and reading about her son going, wow, that sounds like my son, you know, so even though it seems like we all have a similar story, there's something therapeutic about reading about it and how each mother or father has handled it. Then I've got a question. My question is, do you know of any resource area to find out about places like where your son is now? And are there other places like that? You know, it's interesting because in the book, I changed everybody's name to avoid lawsuits or liabilities. Noah is not my son's real name. He actually doesn't know I've even written the book. Except I did mention and get permission at the very end to disclose that he's at a place in Southern California called the John Henry Foundation. And it's long-term care. There's actually one couple that's living there that met there 15, 20 years ago, and they continue to live there as a couple. So as long as somebody follows the rules, they can live there indefinitely. I suppose a lot of people might live there 5, 10 years, or maybe just, I know somebody who lived there for 3 years and then moved on. But it's the only really genuinely therapeutic environment, living environment for people with schizophrenia that I'm aware of in Southern California. In fact, I just read a document recently by a couple of ladies who are up in Northern California who literally put themselves on a road trip through California to go visit every, you know, kind of living situation from people with mental illness. And they ended up listing the John Henry Foundation as the #1 best spot and the only one in Southern California. And there's a half a dozen more in Northern California. But I haven't yet investigated, I plan on doing that, of finding out what they cost. Because just a few days ago, I went online and I was looking at some residential programs on the East Coast. I mean, all kinds of places, Vermont, Connecticut, and they sound lovely. You know, some people they can live on a farm, they can train with horses, they can be in this wonderful rural environment, which is actually much better than an urban environment. But they cost $20,000, $30,000 a month. Who can afford that, right? I don't even know of very many private insurance companies that would pay for that indefinitely. Although there is something called parity laws, and I know a couple of people in California who were able to get their insurance companies to pay for residential treatment because there are laws. You have to fight the insurance companies and remind them that if somebody needs to be in that environment, it's just like kidney dialysis. It's medically necessary for somebody to be in these certain therapeutic environments. So some people have been able to get their insurance to cover it. I know one lady who got her son's tuition at the John Henry Foundation covered for about a year, but then they backed off after that. So I don't know of all the different places around the country. It's something that I'm just starting to get into and investigate. I did that probably maybe even 7 or 8 years ago, and I got frustrated because all I saw were places that weren't long-term. They were 18 months, 6 months. They were very expensive. In fact, even on the phone call last night with the ladies, the NAMI group in Hawaii, even they were talking about trying to create their own housing recovery model because just what's available right now isn't very good. And, you know, maybe I'll be able to find out more and put it on my social media and help people that way. But like as of right now, I don't know any place in Cobb, Georgia that's got really good care long-term for people with serious mental illness. We have a long way to go. Yeah, what else?
All right, we have a few more comments in the question and answer, so I'm not sure if you have yours queued up. Okay.
So once our insurance company refused to pay for residential treatment, they said our policy was for acute care only and that our son needed something like a nursing home policy, long-term care, less than $20,000 a month. Yeah. And it's interesting because there are differences between what can be paid for or covered for people with developmental disabilities versus mental illness. The thing that I don't understand is that if I was an insurance company and I was in the business of saving money, I would not want to see a recycling relapsing thing happen to the patient, to the insured, because that has to be more expensive long term. In fact, we're trying to build that case right now with the Department of Mental Health in LA County with some of my friends, because we're trying to explain to them how the inferior care that people are getting is causing the relapse, the recycling with the hospitals and whatnot. If you take care of people well in the beginning, it should cost less money. And I even saw this statistic or this figure recently, at least in Southern California, as a comparison with the John Henry Foundation. It costs about $42,000 a year. It also costs about $40,000 a year for emergency care for people who are homeless. They're not just laying in the gutter. There's all kinds of emergency services going on. And it costs $80,000 a year to have somebody in jail. So if you don't have to be an economist to know that it's more cost effective to take care of mentally ill people. If you don't want to do it for the love of humanity, if the bottom line is the dollar, then it's still more effective to take care of people, right? And another one of my main objections is the way insurance companies will only cover certain medications. Who made them doctor? Sometimes the doctor will say this person needs to be on Clozapine, and the insurance company will say, well, they need to try 2 other medications before they can be on Clozapine, and the person gets worse. And we also know in mental health or in the world of mental illness that the longer somebody is on the wrong medication or no medication, the harder it is to bring them back to a level of stability. So why are we prolonging that? Why are we ignoring what the treating doctor is saying and letting the insurance companies run the show? To further answer the question of who pays for people to live at the John Henry Foundation, we apply my son's SSI benefits towards the total tuition. So that's about $1,000 a month or $1,200. It is a licensed board and care, but they don't take money from the state. So they can have their own program and do their own rules without, worrying about that whole complicated thing. And then the balance of what is owed, I split with my ex-husband. So it's pricey, but it's doable. And it's certainly, even for me as a parent, it's less expensive than the alternative, which is a lot of drama, a lot of relapse, a lot of, horrible things that we don't want to repeat. Then let's see, another question. Do you think your son was intentionally sabotaging his recovery while homeless, or was it solely anosognosia? Well, I've never even had that kind of discussion with him. I do think it was his lack of insight. I don't think he was intentionally being contrary. I think part of him obviously wanted to be free and not be controlled by anybody and not live by anybody's rules. But at any juncture, if somebody had said, here's a place for you to live, he would have walked right in. He would have preferred that to laying in the street. In fact, there were a couple of junctures where I got him into motels, and he went willingly, but then, the motel managers were telling me he was doing objectionable things. So my son really does have lack of insight. And I once asked a social worker who knows a lot about this. He has schizophrenia himself, but he's higher functioning. And I said to him, I said, my son doesn't have insight into his illness now, but do you think he ever will? And the reality is that some people, if they don't have insight from the beginning, they never will. And some people, when they're on medication, they do have insight later on. So there's no definitive answer when it comes to each individual. A lot of people, you know, they're on medication, they're stable, and yet they still might have one fixed delusion that since they're better now, they can go off their medication. they forget, which is why sometimes we say you should make a contract with your loved one, or you should videotape them when they're unstable and having a psychotic process, and remind them of how things can go. And also I want to say that I am a little bit, even now, on the fence about medication. One lady on the Zoom call last night is a doctor of Oriental medicine, Oriental Chinese medicine. She's an acupuncturist, and she's really, really dreading starting her son on antipsychotics. And I totally understand, because they have serious side effects, or they can. And some people really don't want to go that route. So I don't want to just, you know, leave everybody with the impression that you've got to get somebody on medication. It's just that the ideal circumstances for a lot of people to get better without pharmaceuticals it's hard. You know, they have to be in a rural environment with tons of support, and having a superlative diet and nothing that's going to upset their mood. And it's almost like creating an environment that we can't even achieve, to try to make it completely possible for somebody to not take medication. And then there are people who are higher functioning. In fact, there's a group, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, it's called the Hearing Voices Network. And it is people with schizophrenia who talk openly about their voices and how they manage them, and they do not take medication. And I don't know how that goes for most of them, but there's more than one approach, and there's a lot of different schools of thought within the mental health care field. So insight comes and goes for some people. Another question, speaking of medicine, is Clozapine still working for your son? My son, I do feel it's the best medication he's been on, and there have been some improvements. Like, his memory seems to be getting better, but he's not even really totally aware of it. It's just in conversations that I have with him, his cognitive ability seems to be improving, and he's been on it for about 3 years. And what I've heard is that Clozapine can have continually, gradually improving benefits for a year or more after you're on it. He's also on a couple other medications. In fact, I think he's still on a small amount of Depakote, but for a while he was on a dozen other medications. And when I wrote the memoir, I also consulted with Dr. Robert S. Laitman, who got his son onto Clozapine right away. And he's written a whole book, and he is one of the people campaigning to have it be the first medication to try instead of the last, because he has evidence, along with the psychiatrists that he works with, that the best impact is when it's started right away, as opposed to my son, who waited 10 years before he got on it. So that's what I know about that. Yeah.
Real quick, this is Tiffany again. In the chat, we had someone ask you to talk about medications. I don't know if you took that cue from there, but you were right on it. But they also wanted to submit a comment, and it says, my sister is on a monthly injection. We actually experienced a period of 6 years of compliance before they tried to reduce the medication, and she suffered a relapse. We are now back on track. So your talk on medication definitely was timely.
Yeah, I mean, that is another thing. No matter what medication somebody's on, there's a possibility that there's an immunity kind of response that can be built up, where it might become less effective over years and might have to try something different. I'm really praying for some breakthroughs. you know, people are talking about CBD oil now. And I mean, I'm hoping that there are some breakthroughs, because there hasn't been a whole lot of advances in the medication in 20 or more years. So we'll pray for that. There's a question that's come in that says, where do you see your son in 10 years? Do you think he will be able to live independently by then or ever? And if not, where do you see him living? Wow, there, you know, I have good days and bad days. He has good days and bad days. I would be content if he lived at the John Henry Foundation for a decade or more, and he might need to do that. He only thinks he's going to be there temporarily, so I don't know what kind of power struggles we have ahead of us. But with me and his dad, and with a very supportive staff, I'm hoping that we can keep him there as long as he needs to. And people do learn a lot of good life skills there. In fact, he told me just last week that they had a goodbye party for somebody who's now moving into their own apartment. Now, that said, living alone, I think, might be overrated, especially for someone who at some point in their life is considered gravely ill and needs to be conserved. If they get to that level, they could get to that level again. And one thing that I can see happening that would make me very happy would be maybe if my son lived at some point in the future with one other housemate in a house or an apartment, maybe somebody who is a little higher functioning than he is, who could sort of look after him. That might end up being me, I don't know, but I'd like to see him just be as independent as possible, but he's not there yet. And he's 29. You know, he's still interested in things like Harry Potter wands and playing Pokemon Game Boy. So he's kind of regressed a little bit. He doesn't have the same interests as someone his age, even other mentally ill people his age. So I'm just trying to take things one day at a time also. And that, you know, with NAMI parents, we often do project into the future. We worry a lot, and it is better to just take things as they come. But on another level, I have tried to be really responsible in the sense that I created a special needs trust for him. If he's lucky enough to inherit anything from me and his dad, hopefully he will have the funds he needs to live in a very respectable therapeutic environment and not have to go back into that whole board and care situation, which probably won't even exist, you know, in 5 years, let alone 10 or 20 years. You know, I'm still optimistic that he'll progress, that he'll learn and become more independent. Yeah, I may have to help create more housing though. We'll have to franchise the John Henry Foundation. Yeah. Oh, question, does he stay there willingly? You know, it's funny because he got frustrated a couple weeks ago because part of the program involves exercise, and he was really kind of saying, I don't want to do this exercise anymore. Can you guys, you know, give me my ID card? I'd like to take a walk and not come back. But they, you know, they handled it, and we got him, you know, to calm down. And he actually called me the next day to apologize, which was actually a big milestone for him to be reflective enough to realize how he affected other people in that, you know, that moment of frustration that he had. So yeah, he does live there willingly. Now, things were going fairly well, very swimmingly until COVID hit. And they happen to be following the most stringent, like, nursing care home rules, where everyone who lives there has just been there for whatever it's been now, more than 6 months. They used to take them on outings 7 days a week, or at least have that available. What they've done instead now is they've brought some activities, you know, right on the campus, and they've tried to create more fun things for them to do there. But, you know, it's going to get lifted soon. In fact, people are talking about the holidays and being able to spend time with family again soon. But yeah, everybody who lives there is living there willingly, and they have to understand that when they commit to living there. They end up signing contracts, as many as, you know, the parents sign, that they understand, you know, to have that wonderful, nice environment, that certain things are expected of them. So yeah, they don't take people who they feel are going to be strong flight risks. So what else? Oh, and just as another comment, you know, there's so many different levels of functionality. Honestly, if there were people who couldn't live in an open environment because they might run away and they might just prefer being homeless, which is unbelievable but true, why not have, quote, locked environments for people that are really wonderful and nice, and not like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and, you know, crazy asylum, you know, kind of things. Why not have a really, really nice environment with all kinds of amenities and maybe a local Starbucks, you know, something where people can be safe and nurtured, even if they're, you know how we talk about the prison system and there's club fed, you know, so some people, you know, have pretty nice arrangements, even if they're in prison. How about having a really, really nice locked facility where people like it so much that they don't even want to leave? You know, make life dignified and creative for people. I'm sure you have family members who, they might be artistic geniuses, musical prodigies. They might have a lot of different skills that they could use if they were just encouraged. So looks like we're almost up to an hour. I don't know how long you want to go, or if we have any other questions. What do you say, Peter?
There we go. Let me make a few comments unless another question comes up. First, we want to thank you very, very much. It was very informative. And I'm thinking back after reading the book, one thing I found in the book, a couple things very helpful and interesting, was the idea you often hear with the 12-step program and the idea of someone hitting rock bottom. And I think you were very insightful in saying that someone with a mental illness is a little bit different because they may never hit rock bottom. So you can't necessarily say, well, I'm going to wait for you to hit rock bottom, because they may not hit it. So you have to treat it a little bit differently. It's not the same thing. That's probably very good for the 12-step program in terms of alcoholism, but it isn't necessarily the case for mental illness. And I'd agree with you, and I thought it was very insightful. Also, the talking, you mentioned medicines, and one thing we don't tend to have to the same extent in Georgia that you have there, we have the acute care. So someone gets there for 2 weeks, and then they'll send them out. But the problem with that, and I think you ran into some of this, is in order to get on the right medicine, it often takes months of trial and figuring out what the right one is. And I think when your son, I think in the book it said when he finally went on the Clozapine, which is that's the generic name. The Clozaril is, I believe, the other name for it. Clozapine and Clozaril. I think he was in one of the IMDs, the residential places, right? And see,
IMD, yeah.
Yeah, we don't tend to have that as much in Georgia, which is something we definitely need. And it looks like there's a couple more questions, so I'm going to thank you very much now and see what the two questions are, and then we can finish up.
I'll take a look at that. Also, just to tag on to what you were saying, Peter, if you have a loved one who has what they call dual diagnosis, so they're mental illness and substance abuse, of course it needs to be treated uniquely. But one thing that I forewarned people in my memoir was that you got to be a little bit careful when you're saying that to mental health care providers, because if you're emphasizing the addiction part, they may funnel them into a 12-step program. And like we're saying, they don't have the insight as somebody who can honestly say when they're sober, yeah, I was ruining my life when I was on a drug. You know, so it's like, it's a totally different picture, and you want to make sure that they get the mental health care as much as the addiction rehab kind of thing. Now it says here, a question, is the John Henry Foundation housing limited to only California residents? Well, no. I mean, they have 40, they have 40 openings. I think they might be filled to capacity, or they might have one opening. They're not taking anybody right now during COVID lockdown, but they literally have people whose family are out of the state, out of the country. They don't limit it and say you have to be a California resident, or your family has to come from California to live there. Not at all. But they're a small boutique kind of place, and so they don't always have openings. And my son was on a 3-year waiting list to get in there. Next question. It sounds like parents, brothers, sisters, children of those with mental illnesses could get together and create a place for their loved one to live like you describe. Yes, I'm involved with some committees right now, people trying to do that on their own. There's a residential program in Arizona called the Lighthouse. It was a group of frustrated parents who finally decided to get together and create their own housing model. Sometimes people can get grants. Sometimes they can, you know, find other sources of funding. In fact, a couple years ago, when I was in this little group of people trying to talk about housing with the Department of Mental Health in LA, an official said, you know what, if you create a model of recovery, talk to us about it. We might find some matching funds, you know, to help you out with. And that hasn't happened yet because we haven't presented them, you know, a really working practical model. But if you fight, if you ask, you know, there's no harm in asking, and you can, eventually you might be able to find some niche, you know, like even if your community has funds allocated just strictly for homeless people, they might have some allocation where it can be also for people with mental illness. You got to ask, and unfortunately be somewhat aggressive sometimes. Yep. So I thank you all again for having me. I really appreciate it. I always get fired up and I'll go clean my house now, because I really do love, you know, having this rapport with people, and you know, as we say in NAMI, never give up hope. Some of the best things that have happened to us just kind of fell in our lap. So if we can have bad luck, we can have good luck, and we got to keep up.
Okay, well, I think we'll end it with that. So again, thank you very much, Kartar. That was just insightful. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it too. Bye, everyone.